All right, and we're back. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. All right, so let's get started by going to our slides here. So what we have is Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. So we've been talking about determinism, which is a subject that is very important and has been a point of contention for millennia. And it's been a point of contention between all manner of different schools and philosophies. We said that determinism is the belief that every event is caused, that the world we live in is one characterized by a mechanistic system where in any circumstance there is exactly one way things could turn out, right? And that everything ultimately has been predetermined from eternity. We mentioned that the Ash'arites, as well as Calvinistic Christians, believe in this, as do some naturalists, which is quite interesting. But even though a person does not believe in God, it doesn't preclude them from falling into this trap and in believing in determinism. It's not just the theists that, or some segments of the theistic community, so to speak, that have fallen prey to these misconceptions, but even naturalists and atheists have also fallen into this trap. If you recall, we mentioned that because people have wrestled with this notion for a very, very long time, and primarily the reason they have done so is because the discussion really is about grasping the quote unquote nature of God, right? So in order to understand, as they would put it, the mind of God, in order to get a better conception of who God is and what he's like and so forth and how he operates, they have delved into this area. And so in this futile attempt to understand the creator, not only have they failed to do so, meaning have they failed to understand God, but they have diverged so radically from knowing him, they may have concocted their own idol out of thin air. And we mentioned that the biggest problem with determinism is not so much to do with our own actions, but rather how it affects the philosophers and the mystics' conception of God, right? Because in order for them to absolve us of any and all consequences to our actions, and in order for our actions to be the products of an endless series of events, ultimately it would have to reach God himself. And so that's why many of them have spoken in unequivocal terms where they attribute determinism to God himself, making God subject to the concept of determinism. And we mentioned examples of that in the previous session. What I want to talk about is following that stage, when they get to the actions of human beings, because they began with the premise that God's own actions are not deliberate, but rather they emerge spontaneously and they occur as a feature of his own essence. Because of that, that worldview then casts its shadow on the human world, right? And so our actions also end up becoming completely determined and caused. For example, so this is a quote by, let's see, the first one is a quote by Mullah Hadi as-Sabzuwari, who was a philosopher and a mystic. what they would call a theosopher. And Mullah Hadi Sabzawari has this very lengthy epic poem in which he essentially elucidates and articulates his conception of quote unquote Islamic philosophy and theology in poetic form, right? So one line of that poem is what you see right here. لكن كما الوجود منسوب لنا فالفعل فعل الله وهو فعلنا والعياذ بالله. Essentially what he's saying is, and of course, he prefaces this with a very long line of arguments. I was, in fact, watching a professor of philosophy at an American university talking about determinism, and he made a comment which to me was very interesting. He said that this idea of us being able to make choices in our lives, this is the common sense conception that most of us have. And then he said a lot of most students of philosophy, they have this same common sense conception, right? They all believe that we do control certain elements of our decision-making process. However, he said, even though they start off with that common sense conception, after they've studied philosophy, they then turn around and diverge in different ways, and they adopt aberrations to this common sense. And so it's really interesting that when you do go through the syllabus, you go through the arguments in philosophical discourse, that at some point, because of those arguments and the way they're structured, you end up foregoing and abandoning the most common sense things, right? And so you essentially tarnish your primordial nature, that perfect nature that God created you with. You completely abandon that in favor of what you think are logical arguments and rational reason. So anyway, he does preface this with a very long line of poetry, but ultimately what he says in this specific verse is this: لكن كما الوجود منسوب لنا, just as our existence is attributed to us, our existence is part of us, essentially. He says, فَالْفِعْلُ فِعْلُ اللَّهِ وَهُوَ فِعْلُنَا. And likewise, the actions are those of God, but they are also our own. Now, in essence, what he's saying is that everything we do is in fact being done by God himself, right? God is the one who's taking all of these actions. God is the one saying these words. God is the one taking these steps, and so on and on and on. And so, of course, the implications of that we will get to, but I just need you to understand what they're actually saying in a nutshell, right? Take this in its abstract and raw form, right? We're setting aside all of the arguments that they make in favor of this position, in favor of this assertion, but essentially they're saying that when we commit actions, when we take steps, it's really not us, but rather it's God primarily. And also, in a way, we're like a marionette doll that's being controlled by a set of hands, and that we don't make any choices ourselves, right? Ibn Arabi, and ultimately, before I mention Ibn Arabi's quote, you have to understand that part of the reason why they insist on this concept and this assertion that our actions are attributed to God first, then to us, this stems from another concept, which we will have to cover at some point in the future, known as wahdatul wujud, right? The oneness of existence, the unicity of existence, the idea that everything is part of the same essence, that everything is part of God himself. And so Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, for example, who's this very, very influential Andalusian philosopher and mystic, more a mystic than a philosopher, really, but an incredibly influential personality, someone whose influence is felt to this very day. His works are still taught in some parts of the Islamic seminary, not so much in the holy city of Najaf, because the holy city of Najaf has traditionally been more in line with the tradition and the methodology of the esteemed jurists of the faith, the fuqaha of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, whereas in other cities and other seminaries, the mystical tradition, the Sufi tradition has infiltrated the Hawza, and so this is part of that infiltration process. In other words, he was, he's called a Shaykh al-A'zam. He's considered as one of the most influential, one of the most famous Sufi masters, right? And so he is someone that we're going to have to discuss at quite some length and depth. But I just want to mention a couple of quotes of his that essentially describe where they're coming from. So he says, "Subhana man adhara al-ashya'a wa huwa 'aynuha." Right? This is just a very crude translation that I made. Praise be to the one who revealed everything while he is their essence. He is those things that he reveals, right? In other words, all the creations of God are God, right? But they were hidden and that God has now revealed them. He also says, وَقَوْلُهُ meaning قول Ibn Arabi, سُبْحَانَ مَنْ يُكَلِّمُ نَفْسَهُ بِنَفْسِهِ فِي أَعْيَانِ خَلْقِهِ. Praise be to the one who speaks to himself, by himself, through his individual creations. In other words, when God addresses his creatures, when he speaks to humans, for example, when he speaks to prophets, he's actually speaking to himself. He's speaking to a mirror, right? He's not speaking to separate entities that he has created that are dependent on him entirely, right? That are inherently poor, inherently impoverished, inherently in need of God, inherently ignorant, and so on and so forth, as the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, as the verses of the Quran, as the supplications of the Imams alayhim salam insist on in innumerable occasions. But rather, it's a completely different concoction. It's a completely different perception. When God speaks to his creatures, he's actually speaking to himself, right? Although he's speaking through the individual creations of his, but they are himself, right? Al-Husayn ibn Mansur al-Hallaj, another personality who is once again considered one of the most influential Sufi teachers of his time and also today. Perhaps in his time, it was a different case in the sense that many of the other Sufi cults and groups, they did not approve of what he was doing, partly because he was exposing things to the general public that are usually conserved for the inner circle of Sufi orders, right? So the idea that, for example, we're all just God himself, that's something that Sufi orders would talk about, and it's a very common idea that's promoted within those circles. But to have someone who goes out there and preaches this on a mass scale and speaks to the general public and reveals all of these things, they perhaps saw that as being very, very problematic. And ultimately it led to his death, not just for those reasons, but also partly for political reasons. He was seen as a political threat, and he was killed. But ultimately he wasn't killed by the Shia juristic class, but rather he was killed by the ruler of the day, who were members of the Abbasid dynasty. Anyway, so this person, again, very, very influential from the 10th century AD or the 4th century after Hijrah, he said quite famously, "Laysa fi jubbati illa Allah." there is nothing in my garment but Allah Himself. In other words, what you see behind, I may look like a person, I may look like a human being, but inside this garment, inside this shirt that I'm wearing, inside this coat, God rests there, and nothing but God, right? Um, so that's another example. And again, I'm just mentioning these as, I guess, sample quotes from a massive pool of literature that is available out there, in the form of Sufi writings and poetry and songs and so forth. But again, my idea is just to give you some samples so that you could get a better grasp of what we're up against here and where this is all rooted in. So Shabastari, Mahmoud Shabastari, in his book Gulshan Raz, he says the following, and it's a Farsi poet. I'll read it and then I'll translate it. He says, Musalman gar bedanesti ke but chist, bedanesti ke din dar but parastist. وگر مشرک ز بت آگاه گشتی کجا در دین خود گمراه گشتی ندید او از بت الله خلق ظاهر بدین علت شدن در شرع کافر. So essentially what he's saying is, O Muslim, he's addressing the believers. He says, O Muslim, if you knew what the idol was in reality, then you would know que din dar but parastis, that religion is in idol worship. If you knew what the idol was, meaning the idols are also God Himself. The idols are just manifestations of God. So you wouldn't consider that to be an act of disobedience, because when you recognize that the idol is God Himself, then you would know that to be religious means to worship the idols, which, I don't think this requires any commentary, really. Any Muslim with a common sense conception of God and our relationship vis-a-vis our Creator, as well as what Islam is all about and how the Prophet came to destroy idol worship in its both manifest and hidden forms, this would not be an argument for you. This would be, plain nonsensical garbage. So he says that the idols are God. So worshiping them is, in fact, what religion is all about. If the idolater, if the polytheist also knew the true nature of the idol, he wouldn't lose his way in his religious pursuits, in his pursuit of the truth. He would know that he's worshiping God as he bows down before the idol. So there's no problems there. Nadidu as botillah khalq zahir. All he sees in the idol is this apparent existence, right? This appearance of an idol that's made from rocks or wood or whatever it is. Bedin illat shodan dar shar kafir. And that is why he's considered, according to Shara', according to Sharia, he is considered a kafir, because all he knows of the idol is that it is made of sticks and stones. But if he knew that the idol was God and he continued to worship God in the form of the idol, then he would be just as much a Muslim as you are. Now, finally, I want to mention one last quote, and that is from someone whose name, you can say a friend of the course, because we mentioned his name many times in the past, and that is Rumi, as he's referred to in the Persian language, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. So Rumi has in his book Masnavi, let me actually try and get you the source for this, because I know people are going to say, well, show us the source. And so here it is. So this is in Masnavi, book number 1, so volume number 1. And well, it depends on which publication you're looking at, but according to this publication, printed by سازمان چاپ و انتشارات وزارت ارشاد, so the official Ministry of Cultural Affairs and Islamic Guidance in Tehran, 1373, the first print, page number 154. Okay, so, and I've provided a link here, which I'm going to share with you, where you can actually look it up on this website called Shams Rumi, that just compiles the poetry of Shams Tabrizi and Jalaluddin Rumi. So listen to what he says here, right? This is actually something that I want you to pay close attention to. Rumi tells the story of when the Prophet tells Ibn Muljam al-Muradi that he is going to be the one to kill Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam. So Ibn Muljam goes to Amir al-Mu'mineen and he says to him that I've heard the Prophet say that I will be the one to kill you. And he's anxious and he doesn't know what to do. He's visibly upset. So, you know, as you would imagine. So he's going to Amir al-Mu'mineen to find some kind of a solution to prevent what Rumi considers to be the inevitable, right? Again, we're talking about determinism. And it's quite astonishing how Sufi masters, how mystics, and how many philosophers within the Islamic tradition have adopted an extremely sharp deterministic position. The idea that everything is caused, that actions are inevitable, and that everything we do only has one outcome. There's no way you can change all of this. And again, this goes back to their idea of wahdatul wujud, which we'll talk about in another session. So I'm just taking a few quotes from this, right? It's a very long poem, but towards the end, Imam Ali addresses Ibn Muljam. And he says to him, let me read, and he says to him, don't you worry about anything, essentially. You are not blameworthy, because if you believe in determinism, then blame, guilt, consequences of our actions, none of those things matter anymore, right? They are completely meaningless. The only reason where guilt would be of any value, and the condition of guilt, that is, not the feeling, but for someone to be guilty of a crime, it means they have to have a choice in making their decisions and taking their actions, right? They have to be able to choose alternative options, right, for them to be considered guilty if they commit a crime or the like, right? So the Imam says to him, you are not blameworthy, you have nothing to worry about. As a matter of fact, من همی گویم برو جف القلم من همی گویم برو جف القلم زان قلم پس سرنگون گردد علم. He says to him, all I will say to you is go, because the ink has dried, meaning that the pen doesn't work. The pen meaning accountability, meaning God recording our actions. All of these things, it's all meaningless, right? Because your actions are not voluntary. All of your actions are attributed to God. هیچ بغضی نیست در جانم ز تو. I have no enmity towards you whatsoever. I have no resentment in my soul toward you. زان که این را نمیدانم ز تو. And the reason for that is because your actions, I don't deem them to be attributed to you. I don't see your actions as being your actions. آلت حقی تو فاعل دست حق. You are, haq meaning God. He says, you are a tool used in the hand of God. آلت حقی تو فاعل دست حق. You are the one perpetrating this action. However, you are in the hand of God. It's like when you take a knife and you cut something with that knife. The knife is not blameworthy because the knife isn't making any decisions of its own. You, the person with agency and authority, are the one to be held accountable for what the knife does, not the knife, right? آلت حقی تو فاعل دست حق، چون زنم بر آلت حق طعن و دق. There is no point in taking the tool that's in the hand of God and holding it to account and beating it. No one beats a knife. If you're going to beat someone who uses the knife to kill an innocent person, you have to go beat that individual. You don't beat the knife, he says. آلت حقی تو فاعل دست حق، چون زنم بر آلت حق طعن و دق. Then he says to him, لیک بیغم شو شفیع تو منم. He says to him, have no worry, have no concern. I am the one who will intercede for you. I am your intercessor, meaning on the day of judgment. خواجه روحم نمملوک تنم. So the point here being that to absolve individuals of their actions and to attribute those actions to God is one of the most manifestly, let's go back to this screen. It is one of the most, one of the highlights of Sufi and mystical traditions. And of course, this is not something that was invented by the Sufi orders or the mystical traditions or the philosophers. It's been around for a very long time. In fact, if you think about it, as human beings, we all have a proclivity towards this. We all have this desire, this need to somehow absolve ourselves of responsibility toward our own actions and blame those actions on other people when things don't work out. As sinners, as individuals who wish to defy the laws of God, it's only natural, quote unquote, for us to want to blame other people than us. And so, in a way, what these mystics and Sufis are teaching and preaching is that every crime committed, every sin perpetrated, every immoral act, every filthy and unethical decision are all attributed to God. In a way, every killer, every rapist, every murderer, every thief, every single criminal in history is innocent of his or her crimes. If you are going to hold someone responsible, as Rumi clearly states, then you should hold God responsible. Which is why, see if I can find this hadith. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So let me give you some context while I find this hadith here. The context is there's a group of people. So this is in Bihar al-Anwar. By Al-Allama al-Majlisi Ridwanullah ta'ala alayh. Let's open the page and share it so I can read the entire hadith. While we wait, recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Okay. For some reason this do have an issue with my internet, it seems. So let me just share it here. Okay. All right, here it is. Let me share the screen so you can all follow along. Okay. So, Bihar al-Anwar, as we said, volume number 8, page 322. Look at this portion of the hadith. The context is, as I said, there's a group of people being punished in the inferno, in the fires of hell, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving instructions to Malik, who is the custodian and the gatekeeper of hell. And he says the following. It's very, very vivid. Ya Malik, qul lahum. Right. So the beginning of the hadith contains some extremely gory images of the fires of hell, right? Then God says to Malik, tell them, tell who, meaning the wicked people that are burning in hell. ذُوقُوا فَلَن نَزِيدَكُمْ إِلَّا عَذَابًا. Taste this, for we will not give you anything but more punishment. Ya Malik sa'ir sa'ir. O Malik, I want you to intensify the fire. God says it twice. Intensify, intensify. فَقَدْ اشْتَدَّ غَضَبِي عَلَى مَنْ شَتَمَنِي عَلَى عَرْشِي. For my wrath and anger is intensified against those that curse me on my throne. عَلَى مَنْ شَتَمَنِي عَلَى عَرْشِي. واستخف بحقي وأنا الملك الجبار. And takes my right lightly, meaning takes God lightly, even though I am the overbearing, overpowering, and dominating king. فينادي مالك يا أهل الضلال والاستكبار. Malik then says to them, O people of deviation and arrogance, والنعمة في دار الدنيا كيف تجدون مس سقر. You were enjoying your lives in this dunya. How do you find the taste of saqar, meaning the bottom of hell? قال فيقولون لقد أنضجت قلوبنا وأكلت لحومنا وحطمت عظامنا فليس لنا مستغيث. And the conversation then goes on. What does this mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, my anger is intensified over those that curse me on my throne. Who curses God? And what's this curse? I just want you to think about this for a moment. What is it that would be the biggest insult that one could accuse God of? What would be the biggest insult? What would be the worst thing someone could say about God that would translate in God's wrath in these very vivid and terrifying images and descriptions that we just read? According to many of our ulama, our scholars, the worst accusation, the worst slander, the worst insult against God is to accuse him of our own crimes. So not only is the criminal not taking responsibility for his or her actions, not only is this criminal, this vile creature, not showing any trace of remorse for what they have done, but they dare to turn around and accuse the judge of being the criminal, of accusing God. I mean, the judge is a terrible example here. But for someone to commit those crimes and then accuse God of being the one who committed them, it's not me. Just like Rumi and his description of Ibn Muljam and his conversation with Amir al-Mu'mineen, salawatullah. Can you imagine something worse than this? Something more vile, more filthy. That Amir al-Mu'mineen is quoted to have said to Ibn Muljam that you're not the one who kills me. I will intercede for you. I will look after you. You do not take any responsibility for your actions. You shouldn't because you are a mere tool. You're just a dagger in the hand of God. God wants me dead, using you as a medium, as an intermediary, as a proxy, but ultimately it's God that's doing it, right? Which means it's like saying that while Shimr was seated on the chest of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein to slaughter him, it wasn't Shimr who did that, it was God himself who sat on his chest. And that's something that they've actually said, they've vocalized this, that it's God who did it, right? Shimr isn't blameworthy, Yazid isn't blameworthy, Ibn Muljam isn't blameworthy, Abu Sufyan isn't blameworthy, none of these people are blameworthy. God is the one who's doing all of this. God, when someone commits fornication and adultery, it is God who's committing adultery. When someone drinks intoxicants, it is God who's drinking intoxicants. That is what we're up against. That is what we're talking about. Determinism amplified to its most intense and most vile and most disgusting level. At least when a naturalist, when an atheist, when they believe in determinism, they blame it on the laws of physics. And here you have people who are not only labeled as Muslim, they are praised and they are celebrated and they are quoted from the pulpit of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam, who are not blaming the laws of physics, but God himself. Which is why, and I'll wrap up with this, I always say to people, when you hear Rumi being quoted, what you're getting is this very polished, cleaned up, sanitized version of Rumi's poetry. You're getting excerpts from here and there. You're getting selected quotes, the ones that sound good, the ones that are designed as marketing tools to suck you into that world. That's what you're getting. You're not getting the full picture here. Because if you actually put in the effort and you investigated what Rumi's beliefs were and what he has said, right, you would never, not for a second, assume that Rumi was somehow a Shia. You would never assume someone like Ibn Arabi was a follower of the Ahlul Bayt. And the worst thing is that our naivete has reached such a low level that the argument is made that, oh, he also praises Imam Ali in some corner of his book, and we immediately fall for that. We fall right into that trap. Oh, mashallah, well, that of course means that he's a Shia. As if being a Shia is distilled and summarized in someone praising Ali ibn Abi Talib, when we know for a fact that even the Nasibis praise Ali ibn Abi Talib. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader and founder of ISIS, praised Ali ibn Abi Talib. Does that make him a Shia? Why are we so naive? Why are we so willfully ignorant? Why do we not open our eyes to see what's going on, to see where we're getting this, our culture and our information from? I was going to read you a hadith, but we've run out of time. A hadith from, in fact, Imam al-Zaman, Ajjalallah ta'ala farajahu al-Sharif, the 12th Imam, who is quoted in Ihtijaj al-Tabarsi, where the Imam complains about the naivete of his Shia. And the way he discusses this is truly heart-shattering, brothers and sisters. I think I might leave that for the next session, or maybe our culture session, but it really breaks the heart when the Imam says, for example, Ya Muhammad ibn Ali, meaning as-Samari, قد آذانا جهلاء الشيعة وحمقاؤهم ومن دينه جناح البعوضة أرجح منه. I am hurt, I am in pain from the ignorant, the ignorance, the ignorant Shia and those of them who are idiots. I am hurt by that, right? وَمَنْ دِينُهُ جَنَاحُ الْبَعُوضَةِ أَرْجَحُ مِنْهُ. And those whose religion is lighter than a wing of a mosquito. In other words, they claim to be Shia, but really, if you evaluated their entire religious value, right, it would be lighter than the wing of a mosquito. Inshallah, we'll read the rest of that very, very painful letter of the 12th Imam. May Allah hasten his reappearance so that he may remove these veils of darkness and ignorance from before our eyes so that we could see the truth as it really is. Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqan fanattabi'ah. Always recite this dua. Oh Allah, show us the truth as it truly is so that we may follow it. وَالْبَاطِلَ بَاطِلًا فَنَجْتَنِبَهُ. And show us falsehood as it really is so that we would avoid it. Thank you so much. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I can see plenty of questions. I'll try and answer some of them because I have a bunch of questions from the previous sessions, but we clearly don't have time for all of that. Okay, so the first question says, why should there be a problem with Allah and divine will? I'm just assuming if this would be true, then Allah is perfect in everything, including planning ahead of creation perfectly, so he need not to change his mind over any issue. So he would not change any action he planned ahead. So he planned ahead so neatly. If we deny divine will for God, wouldn't that mean Allah could not be perfect and superior enough because he continuously must be free to change his will about worldly matters? Okay, I won't actually get into that right now because we're not even discussing determinism and the arguments for and against it, right? We're just in the preliminary stages now. But one thing I will say is, again, you seem to have confused divine will with divine knowledge, right? So the quote that you use here is God changing his mind, which is a problematic quote. It's a problematic description, but I guess you're working with your and our collective human vocabulary. But I wouldn't use that term, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has knowledge that is infinite and that is eternal and that is part of his essence, right? That's God's knowledge. Then there is God's will. And God's will is what makes things happen, right? God's will is not eternal. God's will happens whenever he wills for it to happen. God's will is like his creation. He decides for it to happen, it happens, right? So you're conflating those two things. As for God's perfection, God's knowledge is perfect and so is God's action, right? That doesn't mean because it's perfect, it has to be pre-planned. The only reason why pre-planning is, as you stated, a manifestation of perfection is in human beings, where our actions, in order for them to produce the desired result, they have to be pre-planned. In the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there needs no, we need no pre-planning because everything God does, right, is in accordance with his knowledge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does whatever he wills to do, whatever he desires to do, right? And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to do something, it's again, you're equating, I think this is a bigger mistake than the first one. You're equating our mind with that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which again, we'll discuss that in more depth in future sessions. So they think, this is the next question, Allah is eternal, meaning his essence is eternal, meaning his will is eternal, meaning he does things without thinking. Essentially, that's what they say. Ahsan. So someone is saying, after listening to the session Theology 206, which was the previous session, and reading the notes, a question came up in my mind regarding this passage from your lecture. So this is a quote from my lecture. Not only does this negate all of these verses, but if divine will is eternal, is as eternal as God himself, That means nothing can be changed, since it has been predetermined since eternity. That renders God the weakest of all beings. He cannot even lift a grain of sand or change the merest of things unless that was predetermined from eternity. End of quote. My question, why should there be a problem with Allah and divine will? I'm just assuming, okay, I think that's basically the first question with the addition of my quotes. So we're just rereading the same question. Yes. Okay. Next. How do they make the assumption that Allah is controlling us? I don't understand how they do this. If God, again, imagine, I mentioned this example earlier, a marionette doll, right? You know, the dolls that have the strings attached and someone is controlling them, right? Essentially, humans are treated as robots, right? We are not autonomous in any way, right? Even though they say that when we appear autonomous, that is illusory, they say. When we appear autonomous and it feels as though we are making decisions, when we are at a forked road, for example, right? I can either go left or I can go right. I feel like I have a decision that I can make on my own here, but they say that is illusory, right? It means that you have the illusion of choice when in fact there is no choice. All your actions have been predetermined from eternity, right? Which actually begs the question, right? Meaning that they're assuming something based off of this question. They're saying that you have no choice, and even though you feel like you have a choice, that is an illusion of choice when in fact there is no choice. But they're not providing any evidence for that, right? So ultimately they say that because our actions have all been predetermined and are caused by other things, the ultimate cause of all causes is God. Therefore, everything we do, while we think that it is out of our free will, but it's not. Next one says, praise be to the one who revealed everything while he is their essence. Praise be to the one who speaks to himself by himself through his individual creation. How did he make this assumption? That's a good question. Inshallah, we'll discuss. As I said, we'll discuss Wahdatul Wujud in other sessions. A lot of people basically saying this is complete deviation, it makes no sense, and you would be absolutely right. Are you saying that this is what Sunni people think? This is how Sunni people think? I'm not saying that, although, as I said, the Ash'arites, who are today the predominant theological school in the Sunni world, they are deterministic in their theology. So they also say, again, they're scholars. I'm sure if you speak to the random Sunni man or woman on the street, they probably wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about if you quote these things to them, because for the most part, we have the fitrah, we have that primordial nature, and that makes us make these common sense assumptions as opposed to all of this. Why do we say Allah? Okay. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. What about the event of Karbala as we know it was inevitable since it was predicted by the Prophet even before Imam al-Hussein was born? So here's the thing. You mentioned Karbala and prophecies and predictions and so forth. And of course, as I said, these are things that we will discuss. But one thing you need to know for the time being is this. We know for a fact that determinism is false, right? We know for a fact that we make choices, and that is why we have to answer to those choices. We know for a fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created a heaven and hell, and there is a very perfectly balanced system of merits and demerits and punishments and rewards and whatnot. And none of that would make any sense if our actions were determined, and if our conduct was coerced and we made no choice in them whatsoever, right? None of that would make sense. You agree with that? Fine. Now, if anything comes along, if you see an argument, whether philosophical, whether mystical, or whether something like this, that, oh, Karbala was predetermined, Karbala was prophesied, therefore, can we make that assumption? If you come across anything that confuses you or that makes you question this established principle of us not being determined, I'll explain what we actually are later on, but us not being controlled by someone else, and that us that we have agency when we make our decisions. If anything contradicts that, you simply do not think about it for the time being while the discussion unravels and takes place, and see if you find your answers there. In other words, do not be confused by nitpicking different things from here and there, right? Establish the principle, establish the foundation. The foundation is heaven and hell and divinely inspired prophets and God's revelation. And all of those things would not make any sense if there was no agency, if there was no personal accountability and responsibility. So, was Karbala prophesied by the Prophet? Was it predicted, as you put it? The answer is yes. But does that also mean that the actions of Imam al-Hussein and the actions of the killers of Imam al-Hussein were all determined and are the product of causality? The answer is no. How is that? We'll talk about that, inshallah. Did Ibn Arabi curse the Shia, and what are the places and books he says those in them? And the answer is yes. There is a very famous quote by Ibn Arabi in his Futuhat, in which he says that the Shia, well, it's probably worse than a curse because he likens the Shia to pigs, right? He says that the Shia are like pigs, and they appear as actual pigs to people of knowledge. So if you're a person of knowledge, if you're a Sufi master, if you're someone who can lift the veils and see the inner world and so forth, then you will see the Shia and the Rafidah, he says, in the form of pigs. And then he says the reason for that is because they curse the first and the second. So, I mean, it tells you all you want to know. Okay, I think I'll just answer one more question and call it a day, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Sayyidina, for such an enlightening session. Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Brother Ali. This seems apparent and stubborn kufr. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Someone says, I believe Qawali is a Sufi invention, and it's widely performed in Southeastern Asian Shia communities. Could you inform us about its roots in Islam, which I know there isn't any of it, and how it's permitted in Shia Islamic events? Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, I think it's pretty obvious that Qawali, I don't know much about it, don't understand the language for me to be able to study the actual poetry and the songs and whatnot. But I think it's very obvious that Qawali does have Sufi roots, right? Which of course means that there's going to be the names of the Imams are mentioned, and the Imams are sometimes praised. Imam Ali is praised. And again, that's kind of what confuses many Shia, right? They hear the name of Imam Ali and they're like, not a Haydari, and that's it, right? The person is celebrated, the person is, elevated to the position of, nearly to the position of the Prophet. So it's very problematic, As I said, the worst enemies of Tashayyu' also praise the Ahlul Bayt. It means nothing, right? Because we know that to be a Shia means to follow the Imams. It's to follow in their footsteps. It is to love them, and it is to disassociate from their enemies, and it is to believe in what they teach to us, and it's to act in what they show us. So here, all we have is just the names of Imam Ali and Fatimatu Zahra being mentioned and them being praised, but really none of the rest. And in fact, as I said, some of those beliefs are literally antithetical to what the Ahlul Bayt taught, which is why the Imams themselves spoke out. And we'll probably talk about that in a future session. The Imams literally spoke about them, and they mentioned their names. And in fact, I mentioned, for example, Mansur al-Hallaj, the one who said, "There's nobody under my garment but God." He was cursed, according to some early reports, according to some of our scholars. He was cursed by Imam al-Hujjah. There was an actual tawqiyah that originated from the Imam, a letter that the Imam wrote in which he cursed him, and he said that he's a deviant, right? And so the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt have not faltered in exposing this deviation, but unfortunately it's the Shia who are ignorant that kind of lose their way. Someone is saying, I really would like to tell my fellow Shia friends about Rumi's real face. Is there any book in English which I can use as reference? I am not sure, to be honest. I don't believe there's a book that discusses these things, but that's why we have these classes, so that you would have the references and you'd have the arguments and you can go out there and use them to disseminate real knowledge, inshallah. Last question, Sister Anna says, thank you for this clarifying lecture. However, how should we consider the reappearance of our Imam? What is predetermined, and the lead up to it is also based on certain inhumane activities, correct? How is that different from determinism, please? So as I said, in the next session, perhaps we will start to delve into the position of the Ahlul Bayt, right? The actual Quranic interpretations of this, and where do we stand? Are we predestined? Are our actions predetermined? Or are we free? Or do we have complete freedom and agency to do what we will? Or is it something else entirely, right? So we'll talk about that. But the fact that Allah predetermines certain things and that Allah exercises His authority and His dominion over this world does not mean that your actions and my actions are predetermined and they're caused and that they're set in stone. They're predetermined, in fact, in eternity, since the beginning, where there was no beginning, right? All these actions were predetermined and they had to happen in the specific way that they happen now, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, wills to send a prophet at some point, does not mean that my actions and your actions and the actions of everyone around that prophet and the actions of the prophet himself, in fact, are predetermined. There is no equivalency between these two things. Someone is saying, in Islam, is there such a thing as luck, probabilistic outcome essentially in one's behavior? No, we don't believe in luck. What we do believe in is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes decisions. Again, we'll talk about this. Essentially, the concept of takhyir, the concept of us having a level of freedom whereby luck essentially is deterministic, right? Luck is things happening as a result of an endless chain of causality, right? What we say is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes through His will certain things happen along our path that sort of nudge us into different directions and give us guidance and take away guidance. And in other words, our actions are guided by a set of values and a set of things that come our way. And so we end up making choices based on the reality that exists out there, that is the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, we'll discuss those in the future. So make sure you're tuned in and that you don't miss a single session, because this does, as I said, have a great deal of, it's something that is very practical and it affects almost every other facet of theology. So inshallah, we'll see you in the next session. Thank you so much for being with us. جزاكم الله خير. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصل اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Please keep me in your prayers as I will keep you in mine.